We're ready to start our Chapter 10 lecture series. This is Chapter 10, Lecture 1, and we're starting to look at East India. Our learning outcomes for Chapter 10 include compare and contrast the physical environments of the countries in the region, understand the sources and causes of China's environmental degradation, know how China's agricultural economy has been transformed since the late 1970s. Recognize how the late 1970s reforms have developed China's industrial economy, especially being as strong as it is today. Describe the different economic characteristics of China's three primary and globalized urban economic regions. Explore how China's rural and urban population contours have changed as a result of the late 1970s reforms. Explain the success of both South Korea and Taiwan's economic development strategies. Identify the reasons for Japan's past economic successes and its current economic decline. And finally, outline the reasons for and impacts China and Japan's population decline. We'll start by taking a look at a map that's not in your book, but kind of helps simplify some aspects of the geophysical characteristics of primarily China here. We see Mongolia, which is also included in our section on East Asia, North Korea and South Korea on the Korean Peninsula here to the east. And then let's talk a little bit about China, and we'll go from west to east. The Tamarind Basin is a lowland area, internal drainage, where the water comes into this area and simply settles into the groundwater system. This is an area of oases agriculture primarily. It's a very dry, arid region, primarily due to the fact that it is an interior continental region where the majority of the winds blow from across the large Asian continent, and by the time they blow across the continent are extremely arid. The Tibetan Plateau is an extreme highland area, one of the highest regions in the world, with the Himalayas right on the edge. The Tibetan Plateau is higher than some of the highest mountains in North America. We have the Kadam Basin that creates some of the major water sources for the larger rivers that form many of the strong agricultural regions in eastern China. We go into the Laos Plateau. This Laos, of course, is windblown soil, and Laos soil is similar to alluvial soil in that it's very rich in nutrients normally. However, Laos tends to be a loose soil, tends to erode very easily. If there's not terracing in the agricultural regions of the hilly slopes, the soil will wash away, and this is an area of terraced farming. There are some desert regions as we go north into southern Mongolia. The Northeast Plains are a wheat-growing area in particular, more temperate than the southern region. We have the North China Plain and the Huanghe River, also known as the Yellow River. The Yellow River has a lot to do with the color of the Laos Plateau soils, and as that soil erodes, it makes the water appear yellow. This river is also known as China's Sorrow, as it is the region of numerous periods of flooding and much loss of life in the agricultural lands along the banks of the Huanghe. We have the middle and lower Chang basins here, and all of these regions are extremely strong in the east here, especially the Middle East and Southern Eastern region. Very strong agriculture, ranging from just transitioning out of the wheat and into rice cultures, rice growing regions, as well as a variety of other crops. We have the the Changjiang River, or also known as the Long River, or sometimes called in China the Yangtze River. It is the longest river in Asia and the third longest river in the world. This is an important transportation corridor. It's the site of the Three Gorges Dam, one of the largest dams in the world, a very recent hydroelectric power generation project on this river. It's also used for flood control and to help provide for transportation of commodities up and down the Changjiang River further than it could have been done prior to the development of the dam. We have more tropical regions here to the south. Taiwan, the island of Taiwan, nationalist China is here off the southeast coast of China. We take a look at our map from page 240 of our same region. We see Japan off of the northern east coast of China, off of the peninsula, the Korean peninsula, North and South Korea. We have our Mongolian region. We have China here. We have, of course, the desert and interior drainage regions of the western deserts, the Tian Shan Mountains coming out of Kyrgyzstan, the region here into Tajikistan. This is part of the old Silk Road. We have the Tibetan Plateau, the Himalayas, the lower plateaus around Lanzhou in central China, the Laos Plateau. We have Hong Kong here in southeast China, and Hainan Island, another developing industrial region. And of course, Taiwan here off the coast, southeast coast of China as well. Here we see a map of the political units of East Asia. We've already talked about the national regions. Primarily, we take a look here at the numbers of different political units in eastern China. Much of this division has to do with economic competition and economic planning. As we move to the west, the political units tend to be much larger with very low population densities, but the higher population density regions tend to be smaller political state-like units for China. China, environmental diversity. China is the fourth largest country in the world by area. Russia is the largest, Canada is the second largest, and the United States is third. China comes in fourth. China has certain similarities in terms of east-west and north-south range, with a similar east-west longitude pattern as the 48 United States and a similar north-south longitude pattern, latitude pattern as the 48 states of the United States. Spatial distribution of landforms and climates. We primarily have low plains and lower mountains in the east, higher mountains in the west, and desert to the northwest. As you move from the west to the east, rainfall amounts increase dramatically. There's not as much maritime air masses to bring rain to the west of China as there would be in the western United States, and so that creates a difference in terms of comparison of the United States to China, since the western United States has exposure to the Pacific Ocean. This map from page 452 of your text overlays the longitudinal and latitudinal positions of the United States and of China, and we see a very similar north-south range and a very similar east-west range in terms of the two countries. Very similar in size, very close to size. Environmental challenges. Environmental quality has suffered for reasons such as the large population density, and rapid economic growth. Clean fresh water is perhaps the biggest environmental challenge facing the region. Air pollution is the other major problem. Both of these are more of a problem in the east, where the industrial regions are, and less of the problem in the far west, where there's very little water and very little industrial production. Perhaps the most basic environmental challenge facing China is the provision of clean, fresh water. China's huge population and its rising affluence relative to the water resources available is one cause of this problem. Precipitation occurs chiefly in the summer and in southern China. Rapid population growth in the coastal cities has increased groundwater extraction, which has allowed substantial saltwater intrusion during the dry season into the aquifers. Government subsidized water prices are too low to encourage conservation or repair of water distribution systems, which could save a lot in terms of providing fresh water. Water diversion projects to provide irrigation for agriculture reduce the flow of water in the Huanghe River or the Yellow River needed to support agriculture and siltation downstream in the North China Plain. Water pollution is a serious problem. 1/4 of China's surface water is too polluted for even industrial use, and less than half of the water supply is truly drinkable. Agricultural activities and industrial and municipal wastewater contribute equally to the problem. Chemical pesticides, fertilizers, and livestock waste in the surface runoff are the primary forms of rural-based water pollution. Animal waste have increased dramatically because of the rising demand for meat among the more affluent populations in the growing urban areas. Untreated residential and industrial wastewater enters 75% of rivers flowing through urban areas, making their water unfit for both human consumption and for fishing. 80% of China's sewage and other wastewater enters rivers and lakes untreated. Many township and village enterprises, TVEs, that have become critical to China's economic growth drive are the sources of much of this pollution. The other major environmental problem is air pollution. In older urban areas and those regions experiencing dramatic post-reform growth, China surpassed the United States as the largest producer of greenhouse gases in 2006. But two important observations qualify this fact. The movement of manufacturing from the more affluent, more developed world to China explains China's high CO2 emissions. Nevertheless, the skies of China's major cities, especially in the north and during the dry season, are some of the most polluted in the world. Beijing residents are literally choking in a city that experienced only 25 healthy air days in 2006. One important source of pollution, air pollution, is high sulfur coal. Beijing residents and factories are highly dependent on coal as a heating and energy source. An estimated 70% of the coal used fails to meet the government-stated environmental standards. Transportation is another source of air pollution. The Beijing city government has mothballed thousands of older polluting buses and taxis, only to see old vehicles replaced by a dramatic increase in privately owned motorcycles and automobiles. Government estimates that air pollution levels will increase dramatically by 2020 if the consumption of dirty energy and automobile use is not curtailed. A barrier to the reducing of automobile emissions is the importance of the auto industry to the national economy and growing consumer affluence. Although there were only several automobiles, only one automobile per, let's try that again. Although there were only 7 automobiles per 1,000 people in 2005, that number is projected to quadruple by 2020. Problems of global warming aside, the various negative impacts of air pollution has cost China approximately 3.8% of its gross domestic product in 2010. 2007, and in 2010, coal emissions contributed and can be attributed to some 400,000 premature deaths. Let's take a look at the population map here on page 458 of your text. Here we see in the west, of course, very thin populations in the elevated plateaus and the deserts in Mongolia. Mongolia only has a few well-populated regions, including the capital itself and a couple of mining areas. In the far west of China, we have some of the oasis regions of agriculture, showing greater population densities than the rest of the West, but much lower population densities than what we see to the east of China. The wheat-growing regions of the Northeast tend to have lower population densities, as do most of the more rural regions of South Korea and North Korea, although places like Seoul have very high population densities in the industrial region in northwest South Korea. We see some of the highest population densities in the agricultural regions of east central China, and along the coast, the manufacturing cities and port cities, financial districts of China along the coast, kind of a remnant of original effects of globalization as the Western world began to impact development forces in China. We see relatively low population densities through much of Japan, but those, of course, are the highest elevations and volcanic regions. The urban areas here in Japan, of course, we see will be highly high population density. We'll get to that as we talk about China in our later lectures. Japan in our later lectures. We see Taiwan has the highest population densities to the west and tends to be lower populations to the east. And we see strong population densities, of course, along all of the major rivers. The Huanghe or Yellow River here, the Long River or the Changjiang River, or the Yangtze River. You can see many of the river systems have dense populations along them as, of course, the water is used for agricultural pursuits. So China, the east is more densely populated. The Loess Plateau, the most specialized region, the elevated tableland between 4,000 to 5,000 feet above sea level is very important in terms of population density. The North China Plain, extensive riverine surface buildup from silt deposits or alluvial soils, has good agriculture. The Sichuan Basin is one of the largest interior basins in China. It's densely inhabited by an agricultural population, has cool, humid winters and warm, humid summers. The Three Gorges region of the Changjiang or Long River has the largest dam in the world, the Three Gorges Dam, that harnesses hydroelectric power, provide for inland water access for large container ships and flood control as well. Critics claim, though, that it is old technology, that smaller dams are more economical, more environmental friendly, and reduce the cultural impacts. Yunnan Plateau has elevations from 5,000 to 9,000 feet and is dissected upland, has lower population density, but agriculture in the valleys. The northeastern plain is extensive rolling hill surface and is a region of grain farming with a more temperate, cooler climate. The two environmental zones, the Tibetan Plateau has 25% of China's territory, the largest, most elevated plateau in the world, also known as the rooftop of the world, and averages 13,200 feet. And the Tarim Basin is the region of internal drainage to the west with oasis agriculture. So the population distribution can be considered highly uneven due to some of these, especially environmental regions, and due to the climate and rainfall, as well as available water. And so the population characteristics reflect the climatic patterns. There is spatial variation of minority cultural groups that may affect some of that population density as we move to some of the regions along the borders of China, such as Tibet. This chart from page 477 of your text has shown or compares total fertility rate to population growth in China from about the 1600s, mid 1600s to 2012. We see especially rapid population growth through the 1900s, especially following 1949, as the communist era begins to come into play. We see total fertility rates highly variable, but increasing to a peak in the early 1960s, after which a policy of one child per family birth allowance was given. The population fertility rate dropped dramatically after that time. And the population, though, continued to grow due to the large numbers of population. It has only recently begun to taper off. In fact, the tapering off has been so obvious to the government that for the first time since the mid-1960s, the government of China announced in October 2015 that it would allow families to have 2 children now because they were concerned about the increasing age of the population and the need to have young workers in order to keep the economy going and growing. Spatial evolution of Chinese political territory. This map is from page 459 in your text and shows the extent of the early empires into almost modern times. The Shang Empire in the darker blue or purple color was the original core of the region. The Zhou Empire expanded from there. And the Han Empire expanded dramatically during the Silk Road era. The Qin Empire tended to contract the region to a smaller area of control. And then the Song Empire maintained much of its economic power on the coast. We see the Great Wall of China that tried to protect trade and agricultural pursuits and success from the Mongol hordes. It runs across the north part of China here, as well as protecting some of the agricultural regions and provincial capitals. Here we see the paths, 2 paths, of course. There were different paths that could be selected of the Silk Road going through western China and into Tajikistan and Kazakhstan in Central Asia. The Shang dynasty was the first Chinese dynasty from 1766 to 1122 BC. It was the start of specialized urban centers, especially in terms of food management and food production and distribution. The Zhou dynasty, the second dynasty of note, from 1027 to 256 BC, replaced the Shang. And this is the dynasty that infused the tradition of Confucianism as opposed to legalism in the social moral standards of the Chinese people. Legalism tended to make laws to prevent people from committing crimes. Confucianism tried to teach personal responsibility to not commit crimes, and thereby making it a moral obligation rather than a legal obligation to be a law-abiding citizen. The Qin dynasty from 221 to 207 BC, here China became a single state and culture and began to impose a uniformity of culture. And the Han dynasty from 206 to BC to 220 AD. This was the organizers of the first true-scale East Asian Empire, dominated territory equivalent to present-day China. It was concentrated in the north. During this period, there was the construction of the Grand Canal that ran on the interior from Beijing toward Shanghai. This is also the beginning of the period of the Silk Road, and the Silk Road expanded during this time, and trade expanded during the Han Dynasty. The Song or Sung Dynasty from 960 AD to 1276 was a distinctive period for economic development. Here, technological experience helped expand the use of early ripening rice varieties, extending the growing season and expanding production. There were improvements in irrigation techniques, and there were better marketing and distribution systems put into place. Some of our lessons here from this historic geography lesson are that the Chinese people are not static. There are internal forces, typically are where change is introduced rather than external forces, although that's not always been the case. Evidence is that Europe has not always been technologically superior to China, and that the Chinese have many innovations to their credit, things that were managed before Europe became involved or even considered some technical aspects of existence and civilization. The 18th century brings the meeting of the East and the West, of China and Europe. Arrival of the Westerners' trade signaled the start of the demise of the world's oldest culture. Opium trade was one of the big changes here that really impacted the civilization. The First Opium War was a result of a series of situations, economic situations in trade in China. The Chinese felt that the British manufactured goods were of inferior quality and refused to trade for those goods, instead insisting on trade being done in silver. The British, who maintained their monetary standards in gold, had to go out and buy silver in order to trade with China, and they began to find that it was difficult to trade in this way. It would become kind of a money-losing situation. They wanted to find an item that they could trade with instead of creating a deficit with China, and decided to dump opium from India into China. The only other item really being sold in great volumes or traded other than silver would have been cotton produced in India as well. The British expanded opium production in India and started dumping it on, creating a number of opium addictions in China. China recognized the problems with opium addiction and tried to confiscate large amounts of opium from British ships. This started the First Opium War. The Chinese were defeated and were forced to sign a treaty which included the opening of 5 coastal ports. Foreign enclaves essentially became foreign-owned territories for trade with the interior of China. These zones actually are almost the forerunners of the SEZs, or special economic zones, that we'll talk about later on in our modern discussions of China. Westernizing influences tried to create China as a market for manufactured goods, for railroads, for Western medicine and banking, as well as Victorian morality of that era. New China. As China moved into the 20th century, the Boxer Rebellion was the first of 1900, was the first expression of nationalism, back away from these foreign trade situations. The Boxer Rebellion was in opposition to foreigners and to opposition of Chinese doing business with foreigners. The national movements in the wake of the collapse of the Qing dynasty, the end of the last dynasty government in 1911, resulted in the establishment of the Nationalist Party with Sun Yat-sen as the initial leader. Later, Chiang Kai-shek replaced Sun in 1925. In the meanwhile, the Chinese Communist Party formed, established in 1921. Mao Zedong emerged as the leader in 1935. It developed with support from the USSR and became an urban-based party with strong economic support. A civil war between the nationalists and the CCP, or the Chinese Communist Party, erupted, but the invasion of China by the Japanese just prior to the Second World War stopped internal conflict for a period of time. After the end of the Second World War, civil conflict resumed in China, and in 1949, the Nationalist Party members and leaders flee to Taiwan, and which was a Chinese territory and still considered Chinese territory by the Chinese, although there is tolerance between the two political parties. Communists then take over mainland China. That's it for Lecture 1 of Chapter 10. We'll continue with our next lecture as our series continues. Thanks for being here, and I'll talk to you again soon.